Good evening. This is the City of Everett, Washington Planning Commission meeting for Tuesday, September 7, 2021. We'll call this meeting to order and ask for a roll call.
Thank you. Chair Yanasak.
Here.
Commissioner Beck. Commissioner Beck. Okay, I thought I saw her log in. Commissioner Labra.
Here.
Commissioner Zielinski.
Here.
Commissioner Adkins.
Here.
Commissioner Beck, are you there?
We'll watch from Commissioner Beck. I thought I saw her pop up a moment ago as well, so hopefully she'll join us maybe while I'm going through our instructions.
Okay,
thank you.
Sounds good. Thanks.
All right. Instruction to participants tonight is just a reminder that Planning Commission meetings remain remote for the time being. If you are accessing this meeting via phone, please be aware that there is about a 10-second delay on the broadcast and stream. If you wish to download the presentation materials or wish to comment and need to see the visual in real time, please visit everettwa.gov/planningcommission. I would like to remind anyone participating to please mute your microphone, or if you are calling in, mute your phone by pressing *6 until called upon. Thank you for your patience, and stay tuned in the coming weeks for more information about bringing the Planning Commission back to in-person meetings. With that, I'll ask if commissioners have had a chance to review the minutes from the last meeting on August 17th. And if there are any requests for changes or additions. Would anybody have a motion?
This is Commissioner Zielinski. I would move approval of the minutes of the August 17th meeting.
Okay, maybe just to confirm, it looks like, oh, go ahead.
This is Commissioner Labra. I would second that.
Thank you. And I just want to confirm, it looks like we have 4 commissioners present. That is enough for us to vote?
Yes.
Okay, then let's go ahead and call through for a roll call vote.
Commissioner Adkins.
Yes.
Commissioner Zielinski.
Yes.
Commissioner Lavra.
Yes.
Chair Yanasak.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you. Do any commission members have any reports? Okay, how about staff comments? Yorick.
Chair Yanasak. Good evening, everyone. I hope everyone had a pleasant Labor Day weekend. Before we dive into tonight's agenda, just a few notes. First, under the topic of recent items heard by the Planning Commission, the Council took up the home occupations proposed ordinance this month and, last month, August, provided a fairly similar set of questions and comments to the ones that commissioners posed in your deliberations over the summer. Several council members expressed concern about impacts from retail sales and guns and ammo specifically. And on that note, you may remember that when we left off the last Planning Commission meeting, a bit unsure of the legal status of the prohibition on retail firearm and ammunition sales that the Commission had recommended. Staff subsequently became aware of a state law that requires that firearm sales many regulations than any other retail sales. So basically it's either retail with firearms or no retail at all, and the council will need to make that call later this month. Council also had questions about whether there would be any sort of a permit approval process, how the proposal compared to how other cities treat home occupations, and what thought staff had put into potential cumulative impacts on traffic and parking considering home occupations as well as some of the other proposals such as rethink housing. And then also how we could be sure to provide adequate enforcement of the performance standards. So definitely noticed some themes running between both the Planning Commission and the Council. So good to know that both bodies are somewhat on the same page. And once staff has had a chance to compile responses and some additional information, the Council will continue their deliberations and hold a public hearing on the proposal, likely in early October. The Council will also take up Rethink Housing after the Commission recommended approval of that housing action plan. The Council will take that up at starting tomorrow's evening's meeting, and then will potentially take action on September 15th meeting via resolution. In regional planning news, the Snohomish County Council will hold a public hearing and consider approval of the 2021 Buildable Lands Report and Procedures Report tomorrow morning at 10:30. The County Council also heard a briefing on the countywide planning policies update at Planning Committee on August 31st. CPPs to a public hearing and expressed the preference at that time for a substitute version that was recommended by the county executive rather than the version that was recommended by the Snohomish County Tomorrow Steering Committee. The difference between the two versions is, as far as I can tell, limited to policy JP3, which addresses annexation. Cities in the county had sought to eliminate certain preconditions to county support for an annexation, and that was an approach that the executive and at least several county council members did not agree with, at least initially. We will see the outcome of that later this month. Finally, in kind of errata notes, but something that planners should be interested in, the Census Bureau released the first batch of detailed data from Census 2020 a couple of weeks ago. And Everett's April 1st, 2020 population count stands at 110,629. And that is about 2,000 fewer residents than what the State Office of Financial Management had previously estimated for the same date. So they will go through and recalibrate their models and their estimates for population over the last decade based on that more official census count. The housing unit counts, on the other hand, were nearly the same between the census tally and the OFM estimate, meaning that the difference comes from vacancy rate, average household size, and or group quarter population, all three of which I could see very likely being impacted by temporary pandemic effects on Census Day. That's the extent of my report this evening. Happy to, as always, take any questions that any of the commissioners might have. Thank you.
Thank you, York. Any commissioners with questions? All right, so we do have one agenda item tonight, the Comprehensive Plan Parks Element and Parks Impact Fees briefing. But before we get to that, I don't know, perhaps Kathy, you know, is there anybody calling in today who did wish to address the commission on any other item than what we have on the agenda tonight?
Not that I'm aware of. However, we do have guests in the audience today if they wanted to raise their hands, if they're using MS Teams, or unmute their phones, and we can go ahead and call on them.
Okay, so if anybody is listening in or attending tonight who was, again, hoping to address the commission on anything other than the Comprehensive Plan Parks Element and Impact Fee, now would be the time to do it. If you could just either unmute yourself and go ahead and chime in, or raise your hand if you're using the Teams meeting to view the meeting.
This is Ismail Mohammed. Can you hear me? This is Ismail Mohammed.
Yeah, we can hear you, Mr. Mohammed. Go ahead.
Good. How are you, sir? I just have a general question not related to the comprehensive plan. While the conditions are being relaxed on the COVID side, are we seeing any influx of new application permitting process, or how the construction side is moving? Like, are we seeing more applications now than before? And how are we handling those permitting processes?
Ms. Rumpfig, I guess that's a good question. That might be a subject for a briefing for the commission at some point too. I don't know if there's a quick answer to that. Anybody on staff? York?
Yeah, no clear trend. We're seeing continued fairly high volumes of permit applications, and we have throughout the whole pandemic actually. So we didn't really see, from what I've been told, we did not see much of a break from permitting at any point during this pandemic. But the numbers over the summer have remained fairly high, and we're doing our best to process everything. We're mostly back in the office, but still capacity is a little bit constrained due to the pandemic.
Great, thank you. Thank you. Anybody else on the line? Any other guests wishing to address the commission on any other matters that are not on the agenda tonight? All right, thank you. Then I think we will go ahead and move into agenda item 1 regarding the parks plan and parks impact fees. And is that Bob Leonard who's going to be presenting? Mr. Leonard, I welcome you and go ahead.
Hi. Actually, I'm not going to be presenting. Our consultant will be presenting, but I do want to take the opportunity just to say thank you for having us. And we look forward to the input and feedback on this presentation. And I did want to introduce Lisa with Burke Consulting, who's been doing a lot of work with the rest of the city staff on preparing to this point. Thank you.
All right, great. Thank you. Then Lisa, welcome to you, and go ahead.
Oh, great. Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I'm going to share my screen. And hopefully you're seeing a dark blue cover sheet here.
Yes, we can see it.
Great, thank you. Joining me in the middle of the presentation will also be Jason Hennessy, one of our senior associates. But I'll start us off. So we're going to cover the overall Parks, Recreation, and Open Space Plan update that's happening simultaneous with this work on the parks element and the impact fee. I'll give you some background on the engagement process we had earlier this year that gives some context for some of the policy proposals. Then we'll focus in on the parks element update and then with the impact fee that is supported by the policy work on level of service and things like that. So this slide is showing the two components of our project happening simultaneously. On the bottom here is the Parks, Recreation, and Open Space Plan. That's a system plan. Just like sewer and water have a plan, Parks has a plan, and it has had one since 2016. And every 6 years, the city has an opportunity to update it to be eligible for grants. And so the ball got rolling at the beginning of the year, and we did some visioning in the spring and summer. And then we worked on some concepts, including policy concepts that we'll share with you this evening in the summer. We've been working towards a draft Parks, Recreation, Open Space Plan in the fall with adoption by March 1. So that's one component of what we're working on. The other part is an impact fee. In order to have an impact fee, you need to have an up-to-date level of service standard and capital facility element. And so that was the basis for the policy work that's before you at this study session and the range of approaches to the impact fee. So they've been happening in parallel. We did take some of the material we're sharing with you this evening to the Parks Board in August. And there's a connection to some of the earlier visioning work for the PROS plan that we'll share with you. So the idea is to have the Planning Commission review it this fall, as well as, and then pass it to the council as part of the docket process. Because we're doing this work in parallel, we're sharing with you some policies that relate to having a well-functioning park system and support the level of service, because we wanted to make sure when it goes out in the pros plan, there's some, it's been vetted and at the same time. So this slide just focuses in on the parks element, impact fee, and pros plan in 2021, and shows that these relate to the periodic update that you're gearing up to do by 2024. So the work we're doing not only covers the city for the pros plan, which is at least a 6-year plan, it also goes out 10 years, which is what GMA requires for a parks element, and what the impact fee period is to collect money. And we're going to go out and the pros plan will also address the longer term needs for parks through 2044, which will be your new 20-year number. When you finish your comp plan in 2024, it'll go out to 2044. So the pros plan is going to cover a lot of bases and give you a platform for not only now, but for the periodic update. So that's the overall schedule. And then we're going to share a bit on some of the background work, data, and some engagement that kind of form the basis for the level of service work and the impact fee. But just a few words about the pros plan, because it is a little different than the minimum requirements for the parks element of the comprehensive plan. So it was last amended or updated in 2016. I mentioned it allows you to be eligible for grants. That's through the State Recreation and Conservation Office. And it does support other city plans. So certainly the comp plan and capital facility element, as well as the Shoreline Master Program Public Access Plan and Climate Action Plan and other plans. So it is meant to fit in with the city's overall policy goals. So the pros plan, according to the Recreation Conservation Office, should have some major elements, including setting the stage with a vision, having an inventory, and for us that includes parks, recreation, and trails facilities. We're also addressing urban tree canopy, which is important to the city, and to other plans that you have, like Climate Action Plan. It will address goals, objectives, recommendations, and actions. It'll identify a service level, cost, and funding options, and it'll have implementation strategies that will be implemented over time. So now some of the background information. So first we took a look at the city's inventory of its parklands. And there's over 920 acres of parks that perform very different functions. Some are small and serve the immediate neighborhood, and some are regional and draw from Everett and beyond. And there's over 12 miles of trails. That's the interurban and the Milltown Trail. We also took a look at how many parcels were within a 10-minute walk of a park property, and looking at parks that have an active feature, meaning they have something on them. They're not just undeveloped or just a niche facility like the golf courses. We have about 64% of the population that's within a 10-minute walk citywide. These aqua colors are park properties that are like the golf courses that might serve a particular interest. But to the extent you add other facilities on them, or if you develop undeveloped properties, these aqua colors show you can reach more folks to be within proximity to the parks. So in general, what we're seeing is that older, more established districts of the city, like up in the North End and downtown areas, have greater access to parks and recreation facilities. And then as you get towards the south end of the city, you see that's not fully true, with District 4 down here having a very high population density and less access to parks. So you'll see when we come up with the level of service strategy we'll be talking about acres and miles to be added to the system, but we'll also be talking about trying to improve access for the population throughout the city. We also have worked on a community profile that we shared with the Parks Board, and some of this information is in the draft Parks element. And we took a look at the demographics of the population, and different household types or income levels may have different access or interests in the park system. So we were seeing a higher percentage of people of color in districts 4 and 5. And that's what's represented on this map. But you'll see throughout the city, there's some census tracts with high percentages elsewhere. Non-English speaking households tend to be in District 4 in the South End. Children under 5 also tend to be a little bit above the citywide number in District 4. Older adults kind of spread throughout several districts, but a little higher in District 3 over here in the west. And low-income individuals both in Districts 1 and 4. And this just gives us a flavor of who's living where, and as we develop recommendations for the PROS plan and certainly for the policies, helps us understand potential needs and gaps in the community. We also did a vision survey in the spring, and we got about 596 people responding. We also went to Kids Day in the parks at Forest Park and Thornton A. Sullivan. And we sent some postcards to kids that go to the Boys and Girls Club on Casino Road as well. And then we had a virtual workshop where we got some input. And through all those different means, we did see some common themes across all those methods. We saw an interest in trails and better access to facilities, protecting open space, providing greater water access, and an interest in family activities like playgrounds and picnic shelters and things like that. This graphic here is just showing, based on a question, if you had $100 to spend on recreation facilities, what would you spend it on? This just shows a pretty consistent interest in those top activities, but you'll see that in some districts there was a little bit more interest in some facilities than others. So a little bit more interest in family activities or sports compared to others. We also asked where people lived, both at the district level and the neighborhood level, and what kinds of barriers they may have to parks and trails in the community. And we were seeing a variety of answers, and we coded those. And what we were seeing across all the various neighborhoods was pretty consistent concern about transportation barriers, which tended to be lack of sidewalks or safe crosswalks, or lack of bike facilities, or fast traffic. That's the kind of thing here that you'll see pretty consistently. These circled districts are where we saw the most concern in terms of access. We also saw some folks commenting on maintenance and management. That's the red color, and that tended to be about trash or concern about safety with homeless. But in general, the vast majority of the concerns were around transportation barriers. Related to that were connection barriers. So folks saying, well, I might have a sidewalk or a way to get to a park, but there's no park in proximity. So in some neighborhoods, more than others, there was a concern over the distribution of parks. So some of the themes we talked about: nature, outdoors views, shoreline views, playgrounds and trails, concern about safety and litter. Also, a desire for more water access and trails, pickleball courts, splash pads. There's more detail to be had in that survey and the other inputs. And then priorities that people were interested in: trails, habitat, water access, playgrounds, some more interest in family activities in districts 4 and 5, and more interest in active recreation in districts 1 and 3. So that just can help us as we put together the PROS plan and what kinds of ways we can fill gaps and meet needs. And it's certainly contributed to some of the policy suggestions that we have. So that's background in terms of information and engagement. And then we've been working on the parks element and the capital facility element to respond to the input and also to support the impact fee. So in terms of the policy amendments, you'll see in the Parks and Recreation element, we've proposed some updates in the inventory information. Some of the community profile information I just shared is also in the background of that element. We also link parks to other related plans and initiatives so we can leverage those plans. There's a focus on developing an updated level of service. You'll see goals and policies updated and actions as well. Those goals and policies cover a pretty wide range of topics that have come up through the public engagement process. The primary focus is on level of service, but you'll also see other aspects of the level of service get at access and removing barriers. So there's policies that relate to that. There's also an interest as parks are filling the gap areas that there be also an improvement in tree canopy to help with heat island effects and equity. So there's a range of topics addressed. The capital facility element is based on these policy adjustments, especially the level of service. And it is meant to illustrate the capital program that is related to that level of service and identify those projects for a 10-year period. So in the rest of this presentation, we're going to focus on the level of service and the capital program in particular. So the level of service has a few components to it. One is to maintain the current ratios of level of service, or LOS, per 1,000 population for parks and trails. So it gets at what you would build. Access is where do we want to improve the access? And so you'll see the level of service reference trying to get each district up to at least the citywide access share or greater. And then there's a portion of the level of service that is around capital investment, recognizing that the current system that the public enjoys is based on past investment and trying to maintain a level of investment as per person as growth happens. The primary levels of service are these related to what you're investing in and where you're investing in it. And the capital investment just gives you an idea of how you're doing in terms of investment as each new person arrives. But it is not the only factor involved here. You'll see in some of the language too, we have a base level of service, which is the minimum that the city would try to achieve, and a target level of service that's an aspirational figure if resources allow, like if you get fortunate in grants or other means. So this chart was in your packet, and what is trying to show is a few different ways you could measure level of service. We start with the same basic acres and miles that you have today, but depending on how you slice it by residential population only, or what we call residential equivalent, which is the residential population plus a share of the employment that you're expected to have. That's really the difference here. And so that's why the numbers vary depending on how you're slicing those acres or miles. In the end, they produce a pretty similar need based on the idea of expanding as you grow. So today you have nearly 188 acres developed parkland. You have over 900 total, but in terms of developed acres, inventories were showing about 188. probably can't add a full set of acres. Based on your 900 acres you have today, it would be pretty hard to replicate that in a largely built community. But you could leverage the acres you have and develop them. And develop doesn't mean all impervious surface. It really just means if the category of the park is for a passive use and trails, that's what develop might mean for a natural type park, or it could mean adding a playground and sport courts for the kinds of parks that are more developed. But if you were to take that number of acres and the population you have today, and this is using that combined residential and a share of the employment, you would want to add around 63, almost 64 acres of development. That could be, for example, Cemex property in the south end, or in the south end of District 3. That property by itself is almost equal to this number of acres. So that's an example of how you could achieve that, at least in part. Neighborhood acres is taking the combination of your neighborhood parks and the downtown plaza, like the Wetmore Plaza, and saying, if we were to grow, could we maintain this relationship of acres per person or per thousand? How many acres would you need to add if you were to grow like we anticipate by 2031, which is basically taking today's population trending up towards your 2035 target, annualizing that and stopping at 2031. So it is related to your comp plan target. And so on and so forth for paths in parks and regional trail miles. If you were to take a different option and apply it to the residential or the residential equivalent, you get nearly identical numbers, because the idea is you're just taking today's ratios divided by different population numbers, and you're trying to achieve the same goal. So regardless of which of these level of service options, you'll end up within 1/10 of an acre or 1/10 of a mile to what the need is. There's a little variability in the investment amount, but it's all pretty similar. So taking residential equivalent as an example, these are the acre figures we were just talking about as a need. The city has been planning for some time for a range of different capital projects that fit some of these needs. So Emma Ewell Park, for example, is a neighborhood park that's been under construction, that's been on the capital list before. There's other parks like Cemex is on the list in the current capital program to be developed over time. And same with some regional trails. So we're not starting from zero. We have a base of projects that are in current capital lists. In order to get to the level of service that would be needed for the growth through 2031, you'd want to add some additional projects to get to those acres or miles. And so this is a summary of the capital list and the capital facilities element that are largely similar among any level of service options that we have in your package. So there's developed parkland and neighborhood parks make up the large majority of the necessary dollars to implement the level of service. Paths are relatively inexpensive and can be implemented within that 10-year window for less dollars, and the trails are somewhere in between. So these are examples of park projects already known, or a TBD means we know we have gaps to fill, and we know we have some ideas of what could go in those gaps, but we're not sure which properties they would be, and so that's why there's a TBD. So we've done some looking at based on those known projects and identified them by district just to see how the spread of capital dollars might look. And then because we have a lot of TBD on some of those developed acres or the neighborhood park projects, These are currently unassigned, but as we make our way through the PROS plan and have some additional ideas, we'll be able to spread those out to different districts. And then there's some costs that are just citywide that are programmatic, like tree management or other small works, capital projects that are just part of the citywide need. So as we showed in the staff report, the primary options on level of service, you could maintain the current level of service in the 2016 PROS plan, Parks, Recreation, Open Space Plan, that's cross-referenced in your comprehensive plan. It has a per capita investment level known at that time, but it's more complex in that instead of just focusing on broad categories like parks and trails, neighborhood parks, developed parks and trails of different kinds, it gets into ratios of 32 different facility types. So we're suggesting simplifying that and focusing on developed parks, neighborhood parks, paths, trails, and that access percentage, trying to bring up the access percentage as we make the investments. And we do have a per capita investment, but it's not the main driver. It's sort of a double check. The rest of these assets would be tracked. And then within this proposed level of service, we've given you a few different ways this could play out. It has different meanings for how much a development might be charged at the counter, which is why we kind of came up with these different options to show you the different balance point. We still get to a similar goal in terms of the miles of trails or the acres of neighborhood parks or developed parks, but it kind of spreads differently how the payment of the impact fee could work. And so the residential equivalent would mean that we have all of the residential population and we have a relatively high share of the employment included. That's sort of our future baseline. It's where we start. And it's a more balanced spread of the dollars. And Jason will go into this a little bit more later. I'll just give you the big picture. And then we have an option 1 residential equivalent, which says, well, we definitely want to include all the population, but we think maybe by including nearly half of the employment, that might still be high because some of the private employers do have on-site recreation. There are some recreation assets that Boeing has and that the Navy have, for example. And so maybe we cut that employment share in half again. So it'd be more like 23% of the employment would be counted instead of about almost half. And then option 2 is saying, well, we think that employees are more likely to use certain elements of our level of service, like those neighborhood and downtown parks that are where the gaps are where the city has planned to do mixed use and additional employment in downtown along corridors and near the transit stations. So we think they'll use the trails more and the neighborhood or urban parks more. And we'll have the residential pay relatively more on the developed parks and the paths. And then for residential only, that would be what the fee would be per dwelling unit without any contribution from employment, recognizing regardless that residential will pay under each of these, there is an option to reduce the on-site private common space on site, as well as allow someone who's within a half mile of an existing or planned facility to pay a fee in lieu, so that both their impact fee and the fee in lieu would go towards the capital improvements that benefit both the on-site residents and others. So you'll see reference to all of these 4 and some components. We're taking a closer look at this full population and partial employment LOS for its effects on, again, who would pay and how much. And this one would allow the employees to pay some, and so some of the commercial and industrial development would pay a portion, and the fee would be a little higher on residential in this balance point compared to the other residential equivalents. Okay, so I'm going to turn it over to Jason, who will take us through more of the details on the impact fees.
Great, thank you, Lisa. So, getting a lot of feedback. Okay, we'll make it work. So tonight I'm going to present the draft impact fee. Thank you, York. There we go. That's much easier now. Okay. Tonight I'm going to present the draft impact fees that result from all of the level of service standards options that Lisa's been presenting up to this point. As you can see here, what's really driving a level of service standard based upon population is the expected growth in population. Getting back to York's earlier point, our numbers here are based upon the earlier OFM numbers, and we haven't yet corrected the 2020 estimate, which has moved this point down a little bit. But regardless, the city is planning for substantial growth over the next 20 years and beyond. These targets come from the county. So we have a straight line, linear projection to get between individual points of known targets, which is just a really fancy way of saying we draw a line between the 2 points to get to what we think it will be in any individual year, or an approximation thereof. And so you can see that the 165,000 is one of those points. And then the 2050 PSRC vision number is the other endpoint, and we're sort of hitting those with different rates. So the near future actually has the highest growth rate under this condition to hit the 2035 target. Also, this gets to, we've kind of have on paper here some of the different planning periods that Lisa was referencing earlier. So for the next 10 years, we have a particular interest for growth management impact fees, because that's the expenditure period from collection. And so we have all of our capital needs really being tied to that 10-year collections moving forward. We then have the current comp plan period, which is going to 2035. And then we have the PROS plan period, which, as Lisa mentioned earlier, has been put out to 2044 to align with the future periodic update of the comp plan itself. So there's a lot of different plan periods here. For our purposes with the impact fee, the particularly important one is the 2031. And so a lot of our figures tonight will be going from 2021, 2022 to 2031. Should population not occur at these rates, the level of service standards, which are based upon growth, will then kind of be adjusted accordingly. So for example, neighborhood park level service, which says add this many acres per 1,000 people. Should you have fewer people than the targets here add, then that would suggest that you add less neighborhood parks. So it's just a key point that all of these are responding to the growth targets, and that's defining our capital need. So if we go on to the next slide, another important point is that the city's residential capacity is actually not oriented towards typical single-family residential, as freestanding single-family homes. In fact, most of what's current in the buildable lands report is more apartment, condo, duplex, townhouses, things that sometimes are called multifamily, but regardless, kind of something besides that, the single-family, freestanding development that's been predominant in many American cities for the last 60 years plus. So because of that, we have suggested here, or we're recommending a more flexible fee that's based upon the number of bedrooms, and that way it's agnostic to whether or not it's single family or multifamily, but instead responding to just the number of bedrooms, which is a better measure of the number of people that we actually expect to be residing in the residence, and thus, possible park users. Here we have a graph showing the current housing stock as of 2019, based upon census estimates, and it's showing that together 2- and 3-bedroom homes make up well over half almost 2/3 of the entire housing stock. And whether or not that will be sustained, we do know that we can't know at this time, but we definitely would expect that the past will look something like the future. And so a lot of our estimates tonight kind of focus in on that lower part of the distribution and not as much on 4 and 5 bedroom and above, which make up relatively minor amounts of the housing stock overall. So on the next slide, we'll dig into a little bit about that resident equivalent number that Lisa's been talking about. So here what we have are the total number of employees estimated to be in the city for 2020, and then projecting out based upon PSRC vision estimates, the targets, I should say. And again, we have the same planning periods that we're trying to fit our estimates within. And 2031 is a special number for us for this particular, the impact fee study itself. So some of the tables over there are giving us the total expected change in employees for 2021 through 2031, and then 2032 through 2044, the PROS plan ending period. This growth is not as high as the residential growth as a percentage growth, although I'm going to get myself in trouble for that because I haven't compared the numbers, but I'm pretty confident. And so we looked at these from the concept of a resident equivalent. And so what that is the other table on the right side, which is to get to the idea that just as parks are a service that are offered to the public, whether or not they are used, although luckily are, but whether or not they are used, they are offered. In the same way, the parks are available to the employed population of the city of Everett, regardless of if they use them or not. Although we, from multiple studies and sources, we know that that employees do use parks in general, and that having parks tends to be an attractive feature for employers as they're choosing their location. So when we look at the number of hours per week that it would be available to a just full-time employee as our starting point, compared to the total numbers that they're available to a resident, it ends up being around 46%. So that is to say that the availability of parks for a working person is about 46% of that of a resident. This is a particularly important number for our impact fee study when we're talking about commercial growth, because it is a key conversion to kind of get to the idea of this is the equivalent of a resident. So every employee is essentially has a similar, I want to say, service demand as right, that's all backwards. They're about 0.46 of a resident is what I'm trying to get to there. And so it's not really the same as a full resident, but they still have some expected impact upon the system. For the city of Everett in particular, the census in 2018, estimated that 84% of the working population lived outside of the city of Everett. So only 16%, or let's call it 15% of the population both lived and worked within the city. So there's a large number of people that are coming into work and then leaving. And so these are essentially trying to capture whatever use of the park system they may have in the best way that we have available to us, which isn't use numbers because those aren't generally tracked, but instead availability. So that's how we get to a resident equivalent, essentially, 0.46 for each employee is comparable to a resident. And so if we go to the next slide, we'll add these two together. So we have the same resident population base in blue there. And now what we've done is sort of added on top the resident equivalent number of employees. So This is not the same as the yellow line in the last graph, but instead this is that 0.46, 46% of them that we apply then to the total number. So a little less than half. And we just have layered that on top to get us to our expected overall growth. So based upon level of service standards that are being driven by the change in population and here resident equivalent population, we know what our capital needs are, as Lisa identified earlier. And so from that, we can then calculate the expected cost and how that distributes across new growth. Through those calculations, on the next slide, we have our draft residential fees. So here are some of the options for the maximum fee that is justifiable based upon the level of service standards for residential development. So for many of these jurisdictions on here, so there's a lot going on in this graph. For many of the jurisdictions on here, we have comparables. So Marysville, Renton, all the way up to Issaquah, Kirkland, and Sammamish, kind of on the higher end of existing fees. Many of these places differentiate between single family and multifamily. So that's the green and the pink. These are offered here for comparison about where the draft fees lie in comparison to neighbors or competitors in some cases. And then for the residential draft fees of Everett, those are the dark blue and the lighter gray. These are broken out by bedroom. So Everett draft fee there, first one is 1 bedroom and studio, and I apologize, that should say and no bedrooms or studio. So that's a minor error that I can get corrected. But then further over, getting a little bit higher, we have the 2 bedroom and then the 3 bedroom. And as we mentioned earlier, the 2 and 3 bedroom are the 2 most common existing types of housing development. And again, the past often looks very much, or excuse me, the future often very much looks like the past. And so we have some expectation that those 2 will continue to be common forms of development. And so there's one other piece of information on here too, of a dotted line that represents the residential, or excuse me, equivalent residential option 2 as outlined in the staff report. You can see it's a little bit higher than the equivalent residential only, the light gray. And then the dark blue is resident only, which is basically the maximum that the residents themselves are carrying the maximum need. We're not trying to distribute among commercial and residential, which is why they are going to be the highest numbers on the graph. And any of the other options, there were a number of them in the staff report, and the graph was getting a little cluttered. They're going to be somewhere between the navy and the gray, regardless, because we kind of have the max and the mins there, essentially, is what it comes down to. So then the the staff report also discusses the option of commercial rates. So on the next slide, we have the draft version of those along with comparisons to some jurisdictions. Many jurisdictions that have GMA park impact fees do not also, or they do not charge them on commercial, they're purely residential. So the number of the comparable cities from the last slide aren't on here because they don't have them. And we have included Bothell and Mountain Lake Terrace and Linwood, actually, which are not on the prior slide because they do, and so there's a comparison point there. Same with Redmond and Sumner. We also, wherever possible, tried to use the comparable cities from a earlier report. I think the city calls it the Burke report, that was looking at kind of funding options for the city overall and used like 5 or 6 comparable cities. We tried whenever possible to incorporate those in here as well. Anyway, long story short, the draft commercial fees presented here, we have 2 options: the dark blue as the total bar, and then the lighter blue, which is the equivalent or residential equivalent option 2, are kind of in the middle of the pack of jurisdictions with commercial impact fees. Also just kind of wanted to note that we've broken these out into 3 different categories, that industrial, office and services, and retail in the order as presented on the graph. And then there's a NAICS, the North American Industry Code System. I may be wrong about the C, but regardless, it's a system that allows all employees to be kind of given a code, a number. And so any business can be given a NAICS code. And so this allows a correspondence with the current use, land use categories in code, and these 3 that are presented here. So any business can be assigned into one of these categories, with the exception of government and education, which were specifically left out. But any other business besides those 2 categories can be put into these 3. Lisa had mentioned earlier that the option 2 provides for it reduces the resident equivalency factor from 46% down to 23% under the assumption that employees may use them less and that employers also provides on-site recreation opportunities. And so similar to the last graph, it represents the one here is one of the lower fee possible. It's not quite half because of some of the calculation and how it works out and distributes based upon the level of service. But this does provide kind of an idea about where both options lie compared to those jurisdictions in the area that also have commercial fees. Okay, I am nearly done. There are a number of options available for the ordinance. Some of these we've talked about along the way. There can be a resident-only fee, and as I mentioned, many jurisdictions choose for various reasons to do a residential parks impact fee, but no commercial. Alternatively, we can do a residential equivalent that connects the idea about park availability for employees to residents and creates an equivalency there to include that growth in our capital planning and to ways to fund it. Not mentioned, there's an overall per capita investment. So Lisa mentioned in level service options, we've kind of had this one hiding, or not hiding, but it's been on some of the earlier slides, but this is based upon how much the system would cost to replace it. The idea here in general being that the citizens have invested a substantial amount of resources to have the park system that you do, and that we'd like to continue on. That number is significantly higher than any of the fees that are being presented here. And so it's not justifiable, which is why we're not graphing it. We're just showing the maximum justifiable fee. Alternative options that are just kind of along for the ride, no matter which of the above you go with. Phasing here, some jurisdictions choose to give developers time to adjust to the idea of a parks impact fee and may bring the fee in parts. And so maybe for the first year it's half and then goes up to the full amount after that. I mean, there's as many options as there are ideas about it. So you could do thirds. I mean, there's also a number of reductions that are allowed by state law. And the reason that matters is because these reductions can sort of be given for free in the sense that the city does not have to pay back those fees. So in code, it calls it low income housing, which is why we have it in quotation marks there, because that's actually how the law references it, even though most jurisdictions are really talking about affordable housing and kind of getting outside of or increasing outside of just low income. But you are allowed by state law to give low income housing exemptions for free up to 80%, and that's what the ordinance reflects. Anything above that would need to be repaid out of non-impact fee funding. a very recent addition, just this last session, allows for early learning education facility exemptions as well. And then the city can choose to add any reductions it wants that it's willing to add back the money for. So for example, some jurisdictions do 100% exemption for low income and affordable housing, but any amount above what's allowed by law has to be repaid back. So it costs a little bit of money, but it may be worth it as far as a policy decision. I think, oh, and sorry, just last bullet point on the slide, and then I'm all done. The annual update schedule. So to make sure that they stay in line with the capital needs, and as growth happens and you actually will have those numbers and know what happened, the ordinance includes an annual update that's based upon some construction cost indices so that it can actually pay for the project cost as those project costs have increased, which it's worth noting that construction costs have increased substantially faster than like the CPI, the Consumer Price Index, that most of us know more readily. And so it's worth tying it to something like that just to make sure that it keeps up. And then there would be a need to have a larger, more update, connected to the capital project list as it moves forward and things get completed and moved off. So with that, I think, Lisa, I'm going to turn it back to you.
Okay. And I think, Yorick, it's fair to say that we bounced around the idea of how to do the annual update, and I think there might be some footnotes, but I don't know that the language is fully fleshed out in that one. Okay, so we're just back to next steps. So tonight is a briefing and workshop, and then with your feedback and circling back with other interested departments, we'll be finalizing a package for the public hearing, which right now is set for September 21st. And after you complete your review and recommendations, then it'll go to the City Council for briefings, and then a public hearing and final consideration. So I think that's all the slides we had prepared. We threw a lot at everybody. A lot was also in your packet, we recognize. So I guess we'll turn it back to staff and to the chair.
Thank you. Are there any additional staff comments?
Hi, I'm not staff, but I'm just putting myself in a queue if a person who's not staff can ask a question.
Yeah, members of the public, we will open that up in just a moment. I guess I just want to see if any staff as part of the presentation had any follow up on. It sounds like maybe not.
Yeah, I'll just say we can go through the questions, and then our goal is to get a few thoughts from the commission on some of the options that were presented first, but probably worth going through some clarifying questions and any other discussion that you would like to have.
Yeah, I would like to clarify just with this slide here. So will this be coming back before the Planning Commission again at some point, or is this, you're just here today to get our input and questions and that's it?
It's as part of the docket. It would come back to you in a form of a public hearing. So we can reflect some of the direction you might have, as York mentioned, in terms of any options that are of more or less interest.
I guess I could clarify. The reason I'm asking is it's still not quite clear to me if the kind of the question for the Planning Commission is the basic question of whether or not we move forward with any of these proposals, or is that already a fait accompli and really just coming before us to the Planning Commission to see which of these various options we might endorse or recommend to move forward with? Does that make sense?
Could I ask a clarifying question? This is Becky McCrary.
Sure.
Are you asking about this specific item for the docket? Because you had got a briefing at your last meeting on some of the other items that we're bringing forward. And the idea would be that those items plus this item would come to you all at the same time at the September 21st public hearing.
Okay.
Does that clarify what you're trying to?
Well, I guess when I was going through the materials, it wasn't clear to me if this proposal, if the Planning Commission is being asked to consider whether or not a park impact fee is something we want to move forward with at all. Which I guess to me, it kind of struck me as that's almost a bigger question than just for the Planning Commission because of, I mean, fiscal policy impacts citywide, or has the decision already been made, or is we moving forward with a park impact fee, but you're just coming before the commission to try to fine tune the details and kind of get some ideas and preferences about various options for what that actually looks like. Does that make sense?
So I would say that the planning, this is an item that is on the docket for you to consider. If the Planning Commission wants to vote, I guess not to approve the ordinance, that would be your recommendation to the council if you chose not to support on impact fees.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Thank you. Yeah, I appreciate it. Thank you. Then with that, I'd open up. Any commissioners have questions? Commissioner Zielinski.
Yes. My comment is that this is an awful lot of material to throw before the commission and expect an answer or a recommendation from the commission in 2 weeks. And I'm wondering if it's possible to allow the public hearing to go forward, but then to defer a planning commission recommendation, say, until the following meeting in October. Because, I have some familiarity with this subject, but I'm sure some of the other commissioners may not, and we only have 4 of us here tonight. And so I'm thinking this is an awful lot to ask of the commission to actually vote a recommendation in 2 weeks. So I'm wondering if there's any option to defer this for at least another couple weeks into October.
Yeah, Commissioner Zielinski, I guess I would echo some of those comments. I mean, this is a lot of information. I guess I have a lot of questions, and I don't know that even this forum would be able to answer a lot of the questions that I would have, which would probably relate to impacts across other departments, and also maybe potentially go to just generally how the council intends to address larger structural financial and revenue and issues that almost seems beyond the Planning Commission, I don't know, maybe capacity, but that might just be me. Commissioner Beck, you had a question? Welcome, by the way, Commissioner Beck.
Yeah, thank you. And that was going to be my comment too. Some of us have been out of town a lot this summer, and this is an awful lot of information to be digesting and making a decision on in 2 weeks. The other comment I wanted to add here too is the background on this report. I know that you are really far along in this, but my curiosity is I haven't seen any metrics in terms of what happened with the last plan that was done for parks. So, I mean, this is partly my fault because I've been kind of absent this summer. I've had a lot going on. But in terms of, I have been kind of tracking and trying to catch up. I just need more time to absorb this. And I am also looking at, what were those policies and commitments we made with the last plan, and how did we perform on those before we start making big decisions like on the impact fees for this particular plan. So that's just, and my apologies, this is part of my responsibility. I just have not been paying attention as much as I should because of the summer season. But 2 weeks is a pretty short period of time.
Thank you. Any other commissioner questions? Commissioner Lavra, go ahead.
Well, it was a lot of material, and I just had some specific questions. I'm looking at this list of projects, and I'm curious how developed these plans are that you've got a dollar amount on. And also I'm curious about the hard surface preservation program and what that is in the context of parks.
So I can give you an overview, and I'm happy to pull up that chart in the capital facility element. Looks like Bob has some comments he can offer to you, but we started with the city's current capital improvement list. We also looked at, for the sort of potential projects that were not already listed, we looked at average costs based on example projects both in the city and in the region to come up with for example, the neighborhood parks that hadn't yet been cited. Bob, maybe you can speak to some of the more specifics on the hardscape.
I mean, I'm going to say that depending on when the project is slated for, I mean, projects within the next year or two are probably a little bit further along than projects that are 10 years out. The hardscapes, hardscape preservation really talks about the parking lots and sidewalks and pathways and those types of things in and around the park system.
I was thinking that must be what it is, but I just was curious because it was citywide and okay.
It was citywide in the fact that, I mean, not one specific park, but all of the parks within the city. So not, okay. It's still relating to parks, not outside of parks, but just throughout the whole city.
Okay, thank you.
So I can touch on schedule and process a little bit. I think it's certainly okay to anticipate one more meeting with the Planning Commission, so you could hold a public hearing 2 weeks from now and then anticipate another meeting for deliberations and to make a recommendation in early October. This, as Becky said, is part of the 2021 Annual Comprehensive Plan amendments, and you heard briefings on the Hardison rezone and Smith Island map corrections on August 17th. Now you've heard at least an initial briefing on these remaining parts of that 2021 Annual Comp Plan amendments package, the parks element and the park impact fee ordinance. So we can bring all of those together for a public hearing on the 21st and either close the public hearing or continuing it to the following meeting to give you some more time to digest not only the materials, but any comments that come in between now and a couple of weeks from now. As to the big picture question, I think it's fair to say that staff has proposed and initiated this project to develop a parks impact fee and update the park element and the capital facilities element of the comprehensive plan. It's could be considered early work towards the periodic update. This is work that we will need to do anyways between next year and 2024. So glad to have a head start on that aspect of planning for the city. As to the specific options, there are, you saw a lot of those options and sub-options, and that is what we would love to hear your input on, if you do have any, on either the options of the rates, residential, commercial, more of one, less of the other. There were 4 options within there, and if you'd like to go back to some of those tables, you can take a look at how the rates relate to each other. And then there were also a couple other sub options, the phasing, when the effective date might be, would it be appropriate to have a delayed effective date, and that is flexible. The low income housing discount, and I think there were a couple others in there. So would love to hear any thoughts that you have on those options today, as well as any of those questions that you might have. We can either answer them on the spot, prepare some answers for you for 2 weeks from now. And then our goal at the conclusion of the Planning Commission's review of this proposal is to bring a fairly solid recommendation to the City Council for their work. how it relates to overall city budget and some of those big picture fiscal considerations that that you might feel is not within the scope of the Planning Commission. I think we can add some qualifiers to the recommendation that gives the City Council information on what you're certain about and what you're less certain about, that can help them make their decision too. So if there's an aspect of this that you feel like you don't have enough information and we might not be able to get that to you in 2 weeks, you would be able to state that in a supporting note, I would say, at the end of your recommendation. So that helps give a little bit of framing here.
Thank you. This is Commissioner Yan. Go ahead, Lisa.
Oh, pardon me. I just wanted to give one more point, I guess, of context is that it is on the basis of existing parks element policies that this was brought before you. There were policies around exploring a park impact fee as one of the methods to ensure growth pays for growth. And because the city has a relatively high growth target that we've been talking about, that parks are seen as an amenity to help the city achieve some of those targets in those newer centers and corridors.
So I do have a question. This is Commissioner Yanasak. This is a question I've been banging my head against the wall all week, and I can't get my head around it. I'm looking at in the staff memo, table number 3. Am I correct that there are 4 options presented in table number 3, but they're listed as options 1, 2, and 3?
That is correct. We basically, this residential equivalent is sort of our future baseline around which we then sort of vary, you know, the contribution of employment, how much of it, and whether they pay for some or all of the level of service standards. So it just was sort of our future starting point. And then these sort of vary off of this.
Okay, well, it would just be my good for me, and I would recommend that if there's 4 options, they should be presented as 1, 2, 3, and 4, not 0, 1, 2, 3. That was extremely confusing to me, and I couldn't. Because that was so confusing, I couldn't hardly get past anything else. I didn't understand that. That was very difficult. I do have a number of questions and maybe more of comments that maybe I'll just list them off and not necessarily expect you to all give me answers, but just kind of give you some ideas of what comes to my mind. I guess the first thing is I don't have a clear understanding of how parks are currently funded by the city, which I think would give a baseline and help me understand, one, what the shortfall might be, which would help further analyze different options. And how to compare those options. And I guess a question that comes to mind immediately is how are parks currently funded, and what if we didn't impose an impact fee? What would that look like? Presumably, if our population grows by 50,000, the general fund or however else is currently funds would increase at some proportional rate. And why is that not sustainable? Why, to put all this into a bit better context, because I don't have that background information. It's in isolation here. I think it's very hard to analyze it for me. The other thing that comes to mind is we spent a lot of time talking about, there's the housing action plan, about the need for increasing housing types and basically encouraging development, and how can we make housing more affordable? The question that comes to my mind is there a correlation? I imagine somebody has done some calculations for every $100 in an impact fee or such. How does that correlate to number of starts or what types of starts of new construction, and or how would that how would that correlate potentially to the goals for affordable housing? How does that translate into costs of housing on the back end? Because I'm certain that, and I don't know if $4,000 fee, how much of a difference that makes overall to a developer. They're building it. How much would that be? How much would that add to the cost of an apartment complex? How much would that add to the cost of an average there's not a whole lot of probably of single family construction going on, but how would all those impact, and what would that do to our efforts currently to try to increase housing and bring down overall costs? Trying to think what else. I guess a number of just individual questions is when you're talking about employees versus residents, is there any sort of calculation to account for, some percentage of employees who are residents? I know you mentioned that a little bit about a 15% rate. 15% of people working in the city, but I guess maybe I'd be interested to hear a little bit more about that and how to calculate how that accounts, or how that could be calculated to compare different options. And I guess the other thing that occurs to me is that one of the things we were talking about, barriers to parks, a number of those things seem to be not necessarily related to park budgets. For example, access issues. If there's no sidewalks, I don't know, but I would assume that it's not the Parks Department that's building sidewalks or that's providing bus services. There is this overlap. So how would an impact fee address some of those maybe non-parks issues that are affecting level of service considerations? Because I guess at the end of the day, I imagine that there's going to be people who are looking at this. I think parks are worth supporting. I would love personally. I think a lot of people would agree with that. But people also raise a lot of questions about where's the money going to go? How's it going to be used, and where can it be accounted for? So I feel like maybe some of those questions, someone looking at this wouldn't quite have all those answers. It sounds like a lot of technical jargon to justify a tax increase, which may be, there may be a lot of value to people who are paying it, but I don't know that you can necessarily see that directly from the presentation and from the materials here. I would say I did find this memo to be extremely dense and difficult to read and not extremely helpful to understanding. That would be my final comment. But I do think this is important stuff. I appreciate everybody's work on this. It's just a lot of information to be taken in. I would concur with some other commissioners. Commissioner Lavra, you have your hand raised.
Yeah, I was going to make a couple comments and kind of tie in with some of yours, but I did really appreciate more detail about how you calculated this residential equivalence that was given in the presentation but was not in the memo, because I kind of wondered about that when I was reading it. And I have a little, I struggle with the equivalency, because a person who's working in town 9 hours a day, they're not really using the parks unless they park there to eat their lunch or taking a walk at lunchtime. But then the residents are not available to use the park for 14 hours a day. So it's a difficult equivalency to come up with. I struggle with it. I'm not sure I have a better suggestion. And then another comment, I do like the idea of maybe giving a break or an exemption for low income or affordable housing developments. Sounds like a good idea to me. I guess that's all I'm thinking of right now.
Thank you, Commissioner Lavra. Any other commissioner questions or comments? Commissioner Zielinski.
Yes, I just wanted to indicate to the staff that I personally support impact fees. They do provide a mechanism for development to help shoulder some of the costs that it imposes on community facilities. They have been around now for a long time, since the Growth Management Act came out. A lot of communities are imposing them. The city of Everett has been actually imposing transportation impact fees for quite a while, I believe. And actually, developers are now pretty used to them, I think. They've been paying utility hookup charges for ages, and those are another form of impact fees by another name. So I just want to let you know that I do support the idea of impact fees. I think the residential equivalency for employees has to be pretty firmly established for a park impact fees to make that palatable, I think, to our decision makers. So those are my comments.
Thank you. Any other commissioner questions or comments? Okay, well, that was a lot. Any other staff comments or response?
Chair Yanisek, if you'd like, I mean, taking a look at the clock here too, but I think we might be able to get started on some of those questions. I think excellent set of questions from the three of you just now. We could come back with something in writing, which will give you all of the nitty-gritty details and put that in your packet for the next meeting. But I think we do have some general answers that we could put together on how parks are currently funded and what would happen if we didn't impose an impact fee, and impacts on housing affordability and development feasibility, and the rest of the questions that I jotted down there. So I will defer to you on meeting time and all that. I'm out of town at a conference right now, so there's no toddlers needing to be put to bed on my end, but that may not be the same for you all. So I'll defer to you and the other commissioners as to whether you'd like to continue the discussion now and we can get into some of your questions right away, or if you'd rather that we take those back, put some answers into writing and send those along with the next packet, and we can continue the discussion 2 weeks from now.
Well, I am very interested in some responses. I don't want this to go too long tonight, but we do also need to, I think, open up for any public input as well. And I'm not sure how many people we have waiting, so I don't want to give that short shrift. So perhaps if there's nothing else from commissioners, we could move into any public comments that there might be. Kathy, are you able to see, do we have people waiting on the line?
Okay, I do have some guests signed up here
Okay.
that are shown. I was just going to say, it looks like there's a Dylan Sluter who would like to comment. And
okay, I can see that.
Yeah, Mr. Sluter, if you could provide your name and address for the record.
And actually, one moment, Mr. Sluter, before you do that, let me just remind everybody, this is just a workshop. We're not making any formal decisions tonight or anything, just raising ideas and points. So would ask you to, if you could just keep your comments brief, maybe no more than a minute. We'd appreciate that so we can get through everybody and not be here all night. So thank you. Mr. Sluter, go ahead. Welcome.
Thank you. I'm Dylan Sluter. I'm with the Master Builders Association. I'm the Snohomish County manager there. And so I'll try to get through some of my thoughts quickly. This really only came to my desk kind of last week, so I'm kind of with some of the commissioners, and I feel some of your anxiety about the timeline of this, so I appreciate that as we try to review some of it. What I do want to bring up is there is some concerns that we have with this proposal, given that it is a substantial fee increase from basically zero now to potentially thousands of dollars. And to give some background on some data, the National Association of Home Builders does an annual priced out data estimates. And for the state of Washington, for every $1,000 you increase the median home price, you price out of the market 2,500 households from being able to afford that home. And so it is a very price sensitive market that we're into. And so we definitely care about things like this. And looking at the city's housing needs assessment, there's going to be additional 23,000 new units needed. And that's going to equate to about 1,500 new units per year. And just looking back at the annual averages, the city has posted it between 2011 and 2018. The pace was only about, I think, 230 units a year. So substantially behind what needs to be done and what needs to be built as we're going forward. And I think our main concern is sort of the policy discussion on whether or not to sort of have these impact fees, I think needs to happen. And I think that was sort of brought up. And I know it's completely legal to have these, but then also how you implement them. They're very limited as far as how the funds can be used. It's only for system improvements reasonably related to new development, has to have a nexus between new development and the cost. It's not for existing deficiencies or maintenance of and operations of existing services. So it's very limited. And obviously that it was mentioned it must be spent within 10 years. So I think some of my comments would be, could we look at potentially a broader funding source that's more fair and proportionate to who's going to be using the parks, not just putting that burden specifically on new development. So I don't know if you want to look at, there's potential for levies or things of that nature, if that's something that needs to be determined. Obviously, looking at the structural budget, there's a lot of things going on right now with the city, and I understand this is under negotiation, but I appreciate the opportunity to comment. Again, I think this is a pretty substantial increase in fees, and we are concerned with that. And so I just want to make sure that we're able to weigh in and have the time to really review this. I haven't gone in depth. I think you also want to make sure you connect the capital plan projects with new development and make sure that nexus is there, and not that this number is sort of out of whack with projects that don't specifically qualify for the impact fee. So there's a lot of questions I have, and I'll be brief here and say I appreciate the time to comment and to chime in on this, and I'm happy to answer any questions later on. I'm actually formulating an official sort of comment letter. I'll try to get to you tomorrow. I wasn't able to get it turned around this week, so I apologize. But again, thank you for letting me comment and weigh in on this.
Thank you, Mr. Sluter. And I guess I would add a comment. I think it might be helpful to the commissioners and maybe anybody else looking, if perhaps some additional materials could be put together that would include maybe some examples of, you know, sample projects or even just theoretical projects, and what kind of costs we're talking about in total dollars we're looking at that could maybe help relate to, you know, either final sales price of residences or potential rents for apartment complexes, that sort of thing. Because this seems, at this point to me, it seems a little abstract anyway. So thank you, Mr. Suter. Anybody else who wanted to make any comments tonight to the commission? Any other members of the public?
Hi, I am a member of the public, and I'd love to make a quick comment.
Yes, if you could just put your name and address on the record, and go ahead.
Okay, my name is Laura McCrary. I live at 2501 Baker Avenue, and I'm actually on the Parks Board, but I am just speaking for myself, and I mostly have a question because I like the idea of businesses being included in the comparable calculation of use fees. And the reasons are numerous, but I want to know if you are considering the changes in work structure and building structure. So one is that there's such a push to go back to mixed use developments. And so you really change the dynamics of the workspace and the living space relationship. So that's an argument in favor of it being included. And then the other is there's a very different labor structure now, where there's so many people working as independent contractors or gig economy, and that it's a very different impact on communities to have people that are not necessarily working in maybe one small space, but having a many vehicles impact on a community, and not working a 40-hour week, but actually being quite an active presence. So those are just two things. And about affordable housing, please look into how long you maintain the affordable housing as affordable housing in those agreements. And that's all. Thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate that. Any other commenters tonight? I would say go ahead and just unmute yourself and interject, and we'll get to you.
Yeah, I don't see anybody else unmuted.
Okay. Well, I will then go back maybe to commissioners, see if anything else has come up for any commissioners who had anything else they wanted to raise or add. And maybe I'll ask commissioners, I don't know, York did offer to maybe provide some additional information. It is after 8 o'clock. I don't know what the appetite is for commissioners to get some of these responses orally, or if it would be maybe preferable to push that over to the next meeting and get some more materials in writing. Any commissioners have comments on that? Commissioner Lavra, I see you had your hand raised as well.
Oh, I just wanted to say that last speaker, that was a very good point about the gig workers and working at home, and that kind of changes the calculation on how to charge the equivalents, resident equivalent. That's a good point.
What do commissioners feel like wanting to stick around a little longer tonight, or maybe just take some time to digest some of this stuff and start getting some additional answers later? Commissioner Beck?
It's tomorrow is the first day of school for me, and it's going to be a little hectic. First day, I should say, for kids being in the classroom. So I understand if other commissioners want to stay on and ask some questions, but I myself am probably going to have to bail out here in the next 5 minutes.
Well, but maybe let me do this. Perhaps York or any staff want to chime in, maybe just with some closing comments for today, and maybe we'll then wrap it up and look forward to future discussions. This is a very interesting, very complex topic. So maybe York, is there a couple things you might want to address maybe quickly that we can maybe elaborate on later, and just to bring us to close today?
Sure. Yeah, I'll just say thank you for your comments and those from the public as well today. We'll take all of those. I think probably at this point it may be best to come back with a memo before your next meeting. We'll digest some of the feedback that we've heard. We'll revise the proposal. We'll no doubt have some staff meetings and consider some of these things, and we'll come back to you with a fresh staff report and or memo with the answers to the questions. I was going to go and call on some folks. I know generally we fund parks with REIT grants, REIT and grants and some general fund, but I was going to call on other folks to give those some answers off the top of their head, but we may as well do that in writing. And yeah, I guess I will stop there. Stay tuned for more information and a continued discussion in 2 weeks' time.
Okay, thank you. And Commissioner Beck, I see you have a closing comment?
Just one last comment to add to the question list. Since I know that this is something new kind of in terms of the impact fees at park level for the city to be deploying, I'm not asking for a lot of work, who in Western Washington has already been using these most successfully? Just kind of getting a gauge as to what's been done and what have some of the lessons been learned. Because I'm all for impact fees as well, but at the same time, I want to make sure we're not increasing housing costs once again so much that it's becoming even more difficult and more unaffordable to build in this region. So that's the big concern. And again, I apologize because I have not had my eye on the ball. I have just sat down today to look at all this material, and it was quite a lot to absorb. So, but that's my big question is, we're going to be using this tool, and who in this region has used it very successfully in terms of how they've implemented it.
That's great. The conference I'm at is Planning Directors Conference, so I will, with every person I meet, I will ask them that question: how have impact fees worked or not for you? No worries. This is the first that you all have seen it, planning commissioners, and this is the front end of the process. So we'll tighten this up as the process moves along.
All right. Well, with that, thank you to staff. Thank you to everybody for all the information. We look forward to ongoing discussions about this, and I wish everybody who's going back to school tomorrow much success in the year as well. So with that, we will go ahead and adjourn the meeting. Thank you.
Thank you all.